The unseasonably cold October of 1847 descended upon southeastern Pennsylvania, with temperatures that seemed to carry warnings about the harsh winter to come. Frost coating the fields where wheat and corn had been harvested weeks earlier, and where the last vegetables were being gathered before the ground froze solid, creating conditions that made outdoor labor uncomfortable but manageable for those acclimated to the region's climate, while simultaneously serving as a stark reminder that this was free territory where the agricultural rhythms proceeded without the systematic brutality that characterized slavery in states south of the Mason-Dixon line that lay just miles away. In the parlors and meeting houses of Chester County's Quaker communities, in the homes of free Black families who had established themselves through decades of labor in a society that tolerated their presence while never fully accepting them as equals, and in the careful conversations that occurred in places where people gathered who understood the enormous legal risks involved in discussing certain topics openly, there circulated a story about a situation that had been developing over the past 14 months concerning a man whose presence in the county raised questions that no one seemed able or willing to answer directly, creating a kind of deliberate silence around circumstances that everyone involved recognized needed to remain obscure if the people at the center of the story were to be protected from legal consequences that Pennsylvania law and federal legislation made potentially catastrophic. According to accounts that were preserved with remarkable consistency in their essential elements, though with careful vagueness about specific identifying details that might endanger those involved, in the late summer of 1846, there had arrived in Chester County a man of extraordinary physical stature. Estimates varied, but most accounts agreed on height approaching 7.5 feet, who was living and working on a farm owned by a Quaker family whose name was never mentioned in any surviving documentation, and whose specific location was described only in the most general terms as being in the southern part of the county, near the Maryland border. The man was known by what everyone understood to be an assumed name, worked as a farm laborer receiving wages that indicated he was employed rather than held as property, lived in housing that suggested free status rather than enslaved subordination, and yet there existed around his presence a carefully maintained silence about origins and previous circumstances that everyone who encountered him understood signaled something that direct questions would violate. The silence was not accidental or merely the product of rural communities' general respect for privacy, but rather represented a deliberate and coordinated effort by multiple people and institutions to avoid creating documentation or public knowledge that might endanger someone whose legal status remained profoundly uncertain under laws that made the distinction between slavery and freedom subject to challenges that could result in a free person being seized and sold into bondage, or in people who assisted fugitives facing criminal prosecution and devastating financial penalties. Fragmentary records combined with oral histories preserved in both Quaker archives and in free Black community traditions suggest that what was occurring in Chester County during 1846 and 1847 represented one of the countless instances where Pennsylvania's status as a free state confronted the harsh realities of federal fugitive slave legislation, and interstate comedy provisions that meant freedom was never absolute or secure for anyone who had escaped from bondage in states where slavery remained legal, creating situations where Pennsylvanians who opposed slavery on moral grounds had to navigate between their convictions about human freedom and dignity and the very real legal dangers that assisting fugitives involved under federal laws that made such assistance a crime subject to substantial fines and potential imprisonment. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 remained in force and created legal frameworks that slaveholders could invoke to reclaim people who had escaped from bondage, frameworks that were enforced through federal courts, and that could compel Northern citizens to assist in recapture despite personal objections, though enforcement was uneven and dependent on slaveholders' willingness to pursue expensive legal proceedings in hostile Northern jurisdictions, where juries might refuse to convict those accused of assisting fugitives, and where public opinion often sided with freedom even when law supported slavery's claims. Chester County occupied a particularly significant position in the geography of freedom and slavery, due to its location directly north of the Mason-Dixon line and its proximity to Maryland and Delaware, where slavery remained legal, and where the transition from bondage to freedom could be measured in miles that fugitives might cross in hours or days rather than in the weeks or months that escapes from Deep South states required. The county had been settled primarily by Quakers whose religious testimonies against slavery dated to the colonial period, and who had been among the first religious communities to formally prohibit members from slaveholding and to establish networks for assisting fugitives despite legal risks, creating a social environment where anti-slavery sentiment was strong and where violations of federal fugitive slave laws were unlikely to be reported by local residents, even when such violations were technically crimes subject to federal prosecution. Yet this same proximity to slave states that made Chester County a natural destination for those escaping bondage also meant that the county experienced regular incursions by slave catchers operating under federal authority, or simply as kidnappers who seized both fugitives and legally free Black people for sale in southern markets, creating an environment where freedom was never entirely secure, and where maintaining silence about certain matters became essential for protecting vulnerable people from recapture or kidnapping. The free Black community in Chester County numbered several thousand by the late 1840s, composed of people who had achieved freedom through various means. Some had been born free in Pennsylvania. Some were descended from enslaved people who had been manumitted during the Revolutionary era when Pennsylvania passed its gradual abolition law. Some had purchased their own freedom from masters in Maryland or Delaware or Virginia, and some were fugitives who had escaped bondage and who lived in constant awareness that their freedom remained legally precarious despite Pennsylvania's status as a free state. This community maintained its own institutions, including churches and mutual aid societies and informal networks of assistance that provided information about slave catchers' activities and that helped newly arrived fugitives find work and housing and navigate the complicated landscape where legal freedom coexisted with social discrimination and with the constant danger of recapture under federal laws that made no distinction between recent fugitives and people who had lived free for decades. The existence of this substantial free Black population created both opportunities and complications for fugitives seeking security in Pennsylvania. Their presence made it easier for newcomers to blend in and establish themselves without attracting undue attention. But it also meant that the entire community faced risks when slave catchers operated in the area, since kidnappers often made little effort to distinguish between fugitives subject to legal recapture and free people whose seizure constituted a crime. Into this complicated landscape of legal freedom shadowed by federal laws that compromised that freedom and of Quaker communities committed to assisting fugitives despite legal risks, came the man whose presence during 1846 and 1847 became the subject of carefully guarded stories that circulated among those who understood the importance of maintaining silence about certain details while preserving memory of events that demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of freedom in border regions where slavery's legal reach extended across state boundaries. According to accounts that were preserved with deliberate vagueness about identifying information, the man who became known in various stories by names that everyone understood were probably not his actual name had arrived in Chester County in late August of 1846 under circumstances that were never openly discussed, but that everyone familiar with the Underground Railroad's operations understood involved assistance from networks that moved fugitives from Maryland through Delaware and across into Pennsylvania. Networks that operated with careful security consciousness, precisely because federal law made their activities criminal, and because betrayal by informers seeking rewards or by individuals who opposed anti-slavery activities could result in prosecutions that destroyed families financially and that resulted in imprisonment. The man's extraordinary height, which made him physically distinctive in ways that complicated efforts to avoid attracting attention, and that made remaining anonymous essentially impossible in small rural communities where everyone knew everyone, and where a stranger of unusual appearance would inevitably become a subject of conversation, created particular challenges. For those assisting him and for his own efforts to establish security in a free state where physical distinctiveness made him vulnerable to identification if slaveholders came searching or if professional slave catchers learned about his presence and location. The Quaker family who employed him on their farm understood these risks and worked to create conditions where his presence might become normalized through the passage of time and through his establishment as a reliable worker and community member, hoping that local connections and local knowledge of his character might provide some protection if challenges to his freedom occurred. Though everyone involved recognized that federal law ultimately privileged slaveholders' property claims over northern states' commitment to freedom, and that no amount of local support could guarantee security if legal proceedings were initiated. The work arrangement that was established reflected efforts to create a situation that would appear legitimate and legal if examined by authorities. The man received wages for his labor rather than merely food and shelter, which would have suggested enslaved status. He lived in housing on the farm that was comparable to what white hired laborers occupied, rather than in conditions that might suggest bondage. He was free to come and go from the farm within limits that security concerns rather than legal restrictions imposed. and he participated in economic transactions in local communities that demonstrated free status through his ability to purchase goods and to conduct business in his own name. Yet this entire arrangement existed within a framework of deliberate silence about his origins and previous circumstances. A silence that everyone who encountered him understood signaled that direct questions were unwelcome, and that curiosity about his past would violate community norms about protecting vulnerable people from dangers that explicit knowledge might create. The silence that surrounded his presence was not merely passive absence of discussion, but rather represented an active and coordinated effort, involving multiple families and institutions and individuals who understood their participation in a network that was simultaneously providing practical assistance to someone seeking freedom and violating federal laws in ways that could have serious legal consequences if activities were discovered and prosecuted. Quaker meetings in Chester County discussed during this period, though in carefully coded language in official minutes that avoided explicit references to illegal activities, the religious and moral obligations that members faced when federal laws conflicted with testimonies about human equality and divine commands to assist those fleeing oppression, creating theological justifications for civil disobedience that were necessary because assisting fugitives required violating laws that the federal government was increasingly committed to enforcing as sectional tensions over slavery intensified during the 1840s. These discussions acknowledged the very real legal risks that assistance involved, while affirming that certain moral imperatives transcended legal obligations, that there existed higher laws rooted in divine will and natural rights that superseded human legislation, when such legislation violated fundamental principles about human dignity and freedom, and that friends who assisted those fleeing bondage were acting in accordance with Quaker testimonies, even when such actions violated federal statutes. The free Black community's relationship to the man's presence involved its own complicated negotiations between the desire to provide assistance and the need to protect their own precarious security, helping someone who might be subject to legal recapture created risks that slave catchers operating in the area might expand their activities beyond targeting a specific fugitive to seizing other Black people whose freedom was legally secure, but whose documentation might be challenged, or whose capacity to defend themselves in legal proceedings might be limited by lack of resources or by racial discrimination that made courts unreliable venues for protecting Black people's rights even in free states. Yet despite these risks, free Black families provided assistance in various forms: information about slave catchers' activities in the region, advice about how to establish oneself securely, connections to employment opportunities, and perhaps most importantly, social acceptance that helped normalize the man's presence in ways that might discourage curiosity from those who were less committed to protecting fugitives. During the 14 months between his arrival in Chester County and the autumn of 1847, when the surviving accounts suggest circumstances changed in ways that are not entirely clear from available evidence, the man's situation represented a kind of precarious freedom that characterized life for many fugitives in free states. He worked and earned wages and lived without the constant threat of violence that slavery imposed, experiencing daily life that approached genuine freedom in practical terms, yet always aware that his legal status remained uncertain under federal laws that could be invoked to transform him from free worker to enslaved property through legal proceedings that Pennsylvania law required state authorities to cooperate with regardless of local opposition to slavery. This precarious quality meant that complete security was impossible, that certain forms of public visibility had to be avoided despite the normalcy of daily life, that travel beyond the immediate area involved risks that legally free people never faced, and that long-term planning had to account for possibilities that freedom might be challenged, and that rapid departure might become necessary if threats materialized. The silence that communities maintained about his presence, and about the assistance that made his freedom possible, was not total or absolute. People in Chester County knew that someone was living and working in circumstances that suggested he had escaped from slavery. They understood that various families and individuals were providing assistance in ways that federal law criminalized. They recognized that maintaining his security required discretion about details that might make him vulnerable to identification and recapture. But this knowledge remained contained within networks of people who opposed slavery and who understood the importance of protecting those who had achieved precarious freedom, never crystallizing into the kind of public documentation or open discussion that might attract attention from those who would report violations of federal fugitive slave laws to authorities, or that might provide information that slave catchers could use to locate and seize someone whose recapture would generate substantial financial rewards under systems that incentivized professional slave catching through commissions and fees. What happened in the autumn of 1847 that changed circumstances in ways that caused the man to disappear from Chester County as completely as he had arrived 14 months earlier remains unclear from the fragmentary evidence that survived. Deliberately vague in oral histories and completely absent from documentary records in ways that suggest whatever occurred, involved dangers serious enough that even decades later, when direct legal threats had passed, people who remembered events remained cautious about providing details that might be recorded. Some accounts preserved in free black oral traditions suggest that information about his presence reached slaveholders or professional slave catchers who began making inquiries that indicated legal proceedings for recapture might be initiated, creating situations where the networks that had protected him for more than a year concluded that his safety required immediate departure for locations further from the Maryland border, where distance might provide security that proximity made impossible. Other accounts suggest that circumstances in Chester County changed in ways unrelated to direct threats, but that made continued residence there inadvisable. Perhaps increased slave catcher activity in the region made all fugitives more vulnerable. Perhaps changes in the Quaker family situation made continuing his employment impossible. Perhaps opportunities arose elsewhere that promised greater security or better prospects for permanent establishment. Whatever the specific circumstances that precipitated departure, the man left Chester County as he had arrived, with assistance from networks that provided transportation and resources and contacts in new locations, leaving behind only memories among those who had known him, and carefully preserved stories that documented his presence without providing details that might endanger either him or those who had assisted him. The stories that survived in both Quaker archives and free black community traditions served purposes that went beyond preserving memory of one person's experience. They documented the operations of networks that assisted fugitives despite federal laws criminalizing such assistance. They demonstrated the moral commitments that led Pennsylvanians to risk legal consequences for principles they considered more important than compliance with unjust legislation. They revealed the complicated reality of freedom in border states where legal status as free territory coexisted with federal laws that extended slavery's reach across state boundaries. And they preserved knowledge about the precarious nature of freedom for anyone who had escaped bondage during a period when fugitive slave laws made recapture legally possible, even in states where slavery itself was prohibited. The deliberate silence that characterized both contemporary discussions of the man's presence and later recollections of events demonstrates sophisticated understanding among those involved about the dangers that certain forms of knowledge created. Documentation that might help historians understand events more completely would also have provided evidence that could be used to prosecute those who violated federal fugitive slave laws. Detailed accounts that preserved memory might inadvertently preserve information that slave catchers could use decades later to locate someone whose legal vulnerability to recapture persisted as long as slavery remained legal anywhere in the United States. And open discussion might compromise security not just for one person, but for entire networks whose effectiveness depended on maintaining obscurity about methods and participants and locations. The result was a historical record characterized more by absence than by presence, more by what was deliberately not recorded than by what was preserved, creating situations where modern researchers encounter gaps and silences that reflect not lack of events worth recording, but rather conscious decisions that protecting vulnerable people required sacrificing the kind of detailed documentation that would allow complete understanding of how assistance networks actually functioned. Yet even within these deliberate silences and gaps, certain truths emerge from the fragments that survived, that Chester County's Quaker and free black communities maintained active networks for assisting fugitives throughout the 1840s, despite federal laws criminalizing such activities, that these networks successfully provided assistance to many people whose names were never recorded and whose stories were never documented in ways that would endanger them, that the experience of freedom in northern states remained profoundly precarious for anyone who had escaped bondage as long as federal fugitive slave laws remained in force, and that maintaining security required coordinated silence among large numbers of people who understood that protecting vulnerable individuals required subordinating historical curiosity to immediate practical needs for obscurity and discretion. The broader significance of the story about the man who lived in Chester County during 1846 and 1847 extends beyond the specific details of one person's experience to illuminate fundamental tensions in antebellum America between state commitments to freedom and federal laws that extended slavery's reach into free territory, between moral convictions about human dignity and legal obligations that required cooperation with systems that violated those convictions, between public opposition to slavery that characterized many northern communities and the very real legal dangers that active resistance to fugitive slave laws created for individuals who chose to assist those seeking freedom. The story reveals a landscape of freedom that was complicated and contested, rather than absolute and secure. Where formal legal status as free territory coexisted with federal legislation that compromised that freedom in ways that made lived experience far more precarious than geography or state law suggested. And sometimes, according to the stories that were preserved deliberately vaguely to protect vulnerable people, even decades after immediate dangers had passed, freedom in northern states involved not just escape from bondage and arrival in free territory, but also ongoing navigation of legal frameworks that extended slavery's power across boundaries. Careful maintenance of silence about origins and circumstances that might create vulnerability to recapture. Acceptance of precarious security that could be challenged through legal proceedings at any time. And reliance on networks of assistance that operated in violation of federal laws precisely because moral convictions about human freedom and dignity required such violation despite the serious legal consequences that enforcement might bring. The man who stood 7.5 feet tall and who lived in Chester County for 14 months without anyone speaking openly about who he was, or where he came from, or what circumstances had brought him to Pennsylvania, demonstrated through his carefully obscured presence both the possibilities that Northern freedom offered and the limitations that federal fugitive slave laws imposed. Existing in a liminal space between slavery and genuine freedom where daily life approximated liberty, but where legal status remained perpetually uncertain, and where security depended on the coordinated silence of communities that understood protecting vulnerable people required deliberate absence of the kind of documentation that would allow complete historical understanding of events that were profoundly significant, but that could never be fully recorded without endangering those who participated in resistance to laws that moral principle required them to violate.